When RPG enthusiasts decide to make lists of the worst RPGs of all time, there's one game that's never at the top of the list, but can usually be relied on to show up somewhere. Wraeththu, From Enchantment to Fulfillment. But how did this bizarre game even come to exist? Let's grab our trowels and start digging. First of all, this isn't going to be a review. Plenty of people have reviewed the Raithu RPG before, so check out the description for some links. What I want to discuss isn't what this game is, but why. Let's begin at the beginning, in the 1970s. I'm aware that as someone making videos about role-playing games, I'm speaking to a largely male audience, so a lot of you may not be aware that there comes a time in many a young woman's life when she starts having homoerotic fantasies about pretty long-haired vampires. Now, that is quite specific. Tastes do change. I understand werewolves are currently the hot supernatural monster of choice. And if you want to know more about that, do a search for Omegaverse, because I'm sure as hell not opening that can of worms. Anyway, if you're around my age or a little older, this would have happened around the time that the movie Interview with the Vampire came out. So you could just put up a poster of Brad Pitt and Tom Cruise and be done with it. However, back in the 1970s, this movie didn't exist, and young women having these fantasies were instead forced to find other outlets. One such woman was driven to take a short story she had written and develop it into a full novel. Her name was Anne Rice, and her story became the novel Interview with the Vampire. It came out in 1976, and at the time it wasn't actually a particularly big hit, getting mixed reviews. The 1985 sequel, The Vampire Lestat, however, was a critical success, and The Vampire Chronicles became a very successful series of 13 novels, several spin-offs, and 2 movie adaptations. But while Anne Rice was getting her first book published, another young woman was also turning her fantasies into short stories and then into novels. Her name was Storm Constantine, and her novel, The Enchantments of Flesh and Spirit, was first published in 1987. It was quickly followed by 2 sequels in the following 2 years, which collectively became known as the Raithu Chronicles. Storm followed up with a second series of 3 books, the Raithu Histories, in the early 2000s, and also wrote revised editions of the original trilogy. Unable to find a publisher in the UK willing to publish these revised editions, and with print-on-demand technology having developed to the point of financial viability, she set up Imanion Press, a small publishing house that published her back catalogue and the new Raithu books. A third trilogy followed, along with several standalone stories. It's very easy to find parallels between these 2 series. Both of them had cult followings within the goth subculture. Both series received nominations for the Lambda Literary Awards for gay science fiction and fantasy. And while they differ strongly in their settings and the way the titular beings interact with humanity, they have some strong similarities in terms of character and general tone. In short, if you really enjoyed Interview with the Vampire, I would recommend giving The Enchantments of Flesh and Spirit a go. There is one area, however, in which there are no parallels to be drawn, and that is their fanfiction communities. As access to the internet became more widespread in the late 90s and early 2000s, fanfic was increasingly becoming an online social activity, with websites and mailing lists devoted to it. While most authors largely ignored it, so long as no one tried to make money off it, these 2 did not. Here's what Anne Rice had to say on the subject of fanfic in 2000. I do not allow fanfiction. The characters are copyrighted. It upsets me terribly to even think about fanfiction with my characters. I advise my readers to write your own original stories with your own characters. It is absolutely essential that you respect my wishes. And it wasn't long before Vampire Chronicles fanfic was disappearing from the internet. High-profile fans started getting cease and desist letters, which they were not in a position to contest. The website fanfiction.net removed their Anne Rice section after being contacted by Anne Rice's lawyers. Fanfic authors received harassing emails, and in some cases threats against their businesses and even doxing. In short, Vampire Chronicles fandom at the start of the millennium was a nervous place to be. Here's what Storm Constantine said in an interview from 2016. It was brought to my attention that a small community had arisen devoted to writing Raithu fanfic. The main reason these writers had turned to my mythos was because they had been hounded out of another one by a famous writer who strongly objected to their activities. A fanfic writer mailed me about this and asked for my opinion on what I felt about fanfiction set in a world I'd invented and about which I still continued to write. I thought about it for some time and realised that I didn't feel offended at all. As far as I could see, it was similar to a time in my childhood when I'd also invented make-believe worlds, avidly, and the more friends I could get to share in that make-believe and play in my world, the better. This, to me, was the same. People were coming to play in my garden with me. Why should that be offensive? Could I ever stop people imagining these stories? No. Hadn't I myself begun my writing life as a fanfic author? Albeit writing sequels to Greek and Roman myths as a child rather than an established author's work. I understood the impulse to add to an invented world, to want to play in it when the author had closed the gates for the night. Storm didn't just accept fanfic, she actively encouraged it. And she was so impressed with the quality of some of it, she offered to publish it. Take a look at the Amanian Press website and you'll find not only Storm's own books, but novels and short story collections set in the Raithu setting, written by other people. To further support aspiring fanfic writers, Amanian Press began planning a Raithu Encyclopedia, a comprehensive guide to the tribes, locations and history of the Raithu, as a convenient reference work for fan writers wanting to write setting-accurate stories, whether for their own entertainment or to give them the best chance of getting published. And this is where it all started to go wrong. Join me for part 2 to find out why.